I'd like to welcome everyone to stories from 60 years of ocean science with a focus on Oregon State's College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences. My name is Roberta Marinelli, and I have the privilege of being the Dean of the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences and overseeing one of the most phenomenal, productive, collegial, excellent group of faculty, right? In the nation. And in fact, our college was recently ranked #3 in the world in oceanography by the World Council on University Rankings. Let's give that a round of applause, please. 60 years is quite a lot of history when you think about how young oceanography is. And there have been many discoveries that have dramatically increased our knowledge of the ocean and the role it plays in the way the Earth functions, what we call the Earth system. And many of our scientists have been involved in some key discoveries, which I think you'll hear about today. As I mentioned, oceanography does not have the history that fields like physics and biology have. It's really only 60 or 70 years old. It blossomed considerably in the late 50s after the Cold War with the International Geophysical Year, which was a large collaborative international effort to study the Earth. And it matured significantly during the International Decade of Ocean Exploration, about a decade after that, times during which the National Science Foundation and the Office of Naval Research really pumped money into academic institutions and academic oceanography and made a lot of advances in fundamental oceanography and oceanographic science. This was in addition to what the mission agencies, NASA and NOAA, were already doing, which was playing a large role in exploration and observing the ocean. And so collectively, those agencies contributed a lot to our field. In universities and in private institutions, oceanography was primarily a research enterprise focused mostly on graduate education, not on undergraduate education. And a critical part of that university-based research effort was access to research platforms known as SHIPs, which, when you think about the kinds of university research infrastructure that scientists typically have, like laboratories that are built in-house, most universities don't do that. So there had to be a national effort to create access to the sea for all universities. And one of our panelists was actually quite instrumental in making that happen, and I won't steal his thunder. I'll let him tell that story. But suffice it to say that Oregon State has been a leader in procuring access to the sea and has been for a number of decades. And we have recently been entrusted with building the next generation of research vessels called the Regional Class Research Vessel. We're building one for Oregon State, and we'll hopefully be building 2 more for other universities in the nation, demonstrating that we have the capability and the know-how and the trust of the federal government to embark on this very ambitious project. What I'd like to do is take a little bit of a trip back through time and hit some of the highlights of the major ocean discoveries over the last 60 years. I can't cover them all, there's far too many, but I thought I'd hit a few just to give you a sense of how the field has really changed. And then I think it goes without saying that many of the people on this stage have had some role in the transformations of knowledge, and I'll let them link their stories to the broader ones that I'm about to tell you about. So first of all, one of the major discoveries is one of the major enabling technologies has allowed us to do oceanography basically from our living room. The use of satellites to measure things like temperature, ocean color, and then derived quantities like photosynthesis, primary productivity, other parameters like sea ice cover, have really provided a broad-scale view of the Earth in 3 dimensions, both aerially, with depth, and importantly over time, leading us to be able to look at time series of ocean change. Those satellites, in addition to other technologies like moored arrays, so for example, there are moored arrays in the equator, all in the Atlantic and the Pacific and the Indian Oceans that allow us to look at tropical weather and climate. There are floating things like Argo platforms that allow us to measure temperature and salinity, ocean currents all over the globe. And then there are cool robots like the glider that you see here that allow us to send little submarines out, get data, all of these things, beam it back to us remotely so that you don't actually have to go to sea to get a lot of information. And that's really revolutionized oceanography. Another important discovery is the complexity of the pelagic food web. When I was growing up, and we won't talk about how long ago that was, the ocean food web was phytoplankton, little plants, little shrimp-like creatures called zooplankton, and then fish. But now, over the last 20 or 30 years, it's really been discovered that microbes, bacteria, viruses, and all of the single-celled organisms that do a lot of heavy lifting in cycling materials and nutrients, and they dominate the ocean food web. So you can see up at the top there, phytoplankton, zooplankton, fish is just kind of a teeny line. And coupled with that recognition is the development of advanced technologies, our ability to really look at DNA and link it to metabolic processes that have showed a lot of different pathways in the ocean in which material can move. And that's important for ocean ecology and for things like fish production, but it's also important to understanding globally how the Earth cycles nutrients and carbon. So that's another significant one. A third one is that the deep sea is not a vast, cold, food-poor underwater desert, and in fact, neither are polar regions. They are actually vibrant ecosystems. So I've shown a picture of an octopus that was discovered on the abyssal plain, but there are also other very vibrant areas like hydrothermal vents that have really pushed our thinking about how complex the deep sea is. And it's taken oceanography, which was primarily at the time a discovery and sort of exploration discipline as far as deep sea biology was concerned, really into the mainstream ecological literature, simply because we couldn't understand how it was that these very sort of monotonous, cold environments that didn't have a lot of input, didn't seem to have a lot of activity, could support such a rich fauna and amazing swath of biological processes. If you couple that with our ability to drill into sediments and look at the history of the Earth and the contents of those sediments, we've now discovered, or we think we may have discovered, that much of the carbon in the Earth is actually below the sediment surface and not above it, and not buried carbon, active carbon, not just dead carbon. And that the microbes associated with that carbon are very unique and may have metabolic pathways that we haven't thought about. Couple that with the fact that looking at sediments also allows us to look at the Earth's history. We can study organisms that were buried. We can look at their chemical composition, and that tells us things about how climate has changed through time, the mechanisms that might be responsible for that, and it allows us to take that knowledge, apply it to what we see happening in our modern Earth, and perhaps make some predictions about the future. Another important discovery, which is much more recent, involves the ocean carbon cycle and ocean acidification. Many years ago, Roger Revelle, who is an eminent scientist at Scripps Institution of Oceanography and who studied ocean carbon, made a very significant link between the carbon cycle and anthropogenic CO2 and climate. And one of his proteges, Charles David Keeling, was encouraged to go out and measure atmospheric carbon in a bunch of different locations. And his body of work produced the Keeling curve, which actually characterized the accumulation of anthropogenic carbon in the atmosphere over the industrial era. And that provided a very strong link between human activities and climate. Subsequently, scientists have discovered and measured the fact that the Earth is absorbing about 30% of the carbon dioxide that humans have placed into the atmosphere, and that has led to what's commonly called the other CO2 problem, which is ocean acidification. And oceanification is simply a byproduct of the fact that when carbon enters the ocean and it dissociates, it tends to drive up the acidity of the seawater and create significant difficulties for shell-bearing organisms under certain oceanographic conditions. And many of our scientists here have really been instrumental in looking at that problem and trying to find solutions for people who have to grow shellfish in our coastal waters and cope with the problem of lowered pH. Finally, the last thing that I'll bring up before I turn it over to our panelists and introduce them is the importance of iron and other micronutrients that are critical to the health of ocean ecosystems. So just like humans, plants require micronutrients. And it wasn't, and for many, many years, it was observed that there were areas of the ocean that had high nutrients and very low amounts of chlorophyll, and nobody could figure out why. And with the development of advanced analytical instrumentation, a scientist by the name of John Martin was able to determine that limitation of iron, so you remember iron, poor blood, and anemia, well, plants had the same problem. And limitation of iron was what was preventing plants from being more productive than they were. And he then went on to develop a hypothesis that if you fertilized the ocean, you could draw down a lot of CO2, which would then perhaps mitigate the influence of anthropogenic carbon dioxide production and accumulation into the atmosphere. That spawned a whole range of debates about a concept called geoengineering. Can we actually undo the damage that we've done by fertilizing the ocean? But on the more scientific side, he also hypothesized that geologic change in the past resulted from fertilization of the ocean by dust that came off continents. And if dust came off continents and entered into the ocean and iron was liberated, plants would photosynthesize, they'd take up carbon dioxide. That carbon dioxide would sink into the ocean, and then you'd develop, over time, an ice age. So what I tried to do here is just give you a smattering of highlights that I think are important. There are probably 20 or 30 more that I could have talked about, but you didn't come here to listen to me. You came here to listen to some of our great scientists, and I'm going to take a moment to introduce them. Okay. I should note that we have scientists who have been here for a while and are retired but are still active, and then we have young scientists as well. And so, you know, because the past is prologue, I'm just going to make the suggestion that the brilliant scientists of the past are going to be carrying forward into with the brilliant scientists of the future. And so we have a whole age distribution of folks that can talk to you about the history and also the future. So first up is Alejandro Sanchez Rios, who's a PhD candidate working under the direction of Dr. Kip Shearman. She studies physical oceanography, and she's looking in particular at the upper ocean using state-of-the-art technologies, some of which I referred to in my earlier slide, measuring temperature, salinity, and other parameters. Next is Bob Smith, who's a professor emeritus of physical oceanography. He came to Oregon State in 1960. Thanks, Abby. And worked under physical oceanographer June Petula, receiving his PhD in 1964 for the study of coastal upwelling. And his work is focused on the physical oceanography over the continental shelf and slope, especially eastern boundary currents. Next. Oh, I'll do that. Okay. Next is Bob Collier, who is a professor emeritus of ocean ecology and biogeochemistry. He arrived at OSU 37 years ago, known as a triple beaver. And what that means is he has degrees from 3 universities, all of which have beaver mascots, MIT, Caltech, and OSU. He specializes in trace metals and explorations of fluids that vent from the seafloor. He participated in the discovery of hydrothermal vents. He's dived in submersibles in many interesting places, including Crater Lake. And along with Jack Barth and Ed Dever, he has been responsible for pioneering one of the new remote observing technologies that he'll talk to you about, the Oceans Observing Initiative, one component of which is off the Oregon coast. And then on the other side, we have Lori Juranic, who's an assistant professor of ocean ecology and biogeochemistry. Lori uses dissolved gases to track ocean metabolism, and that's basically all the churning of the microbes and the other organisms in the ocean that really push the flow of nutrients through the ecosystem. And she's worked in a number of different oceans. Most recently, she's had cruises in the very warm waters of Hawaii and the cold ice-covered Arctic Ocean, and I think she'll show you some information from that work today. Bob Jacobson attended Oregon State as an undergraduate and a member of the Beaver basketball team, graduating with a degree in business and technology in 1963. But he became the country's first marine extension agent, taking the knowledge that's produced by scientists and bringing it to society. And he worked with coastal fishermen and seafood processors, as well as policymakers, for nearly 3 decades. Burke Hale is a professor of ocean ecology and biogeochemistry. Burke builds many things, but one of the things he's most famous for is building what's now known as the Burkolator, which is a system that helps us measure ocean acidification in many environments, but for this community, it's been very important in coastal acidification monitoring and helping our shellfish growers be successful. Leaving that not quite behind, but to the side, he's now involved in developing a grid-connected wave energy test facility off the coast of Newport. And then John Byrne came to OSU in 1960 as a faculty member in oceanography. He later became department chair and then dean and then director of the Hatfield Marine Science Center and then vice president for research and graduate studies, all the way up through the system. Then he stepped aside over to Washington for a while, where he served as the administrator of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and then stepping back to Oregon, became OSU's 12th president in 1984. So over the next 45 minutes or so, you're going to hear from each of these panelists. They're going to talk a little bit about their work, and then we're going to open it up for questions.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for coming. Preparing for this was a little bit, I was like, what can I show that might be new, or what can I show to a lot of people here who might know much more from oceanography that I do. As Roberta mentioned, I am a graduate student in physical oceanography. I did my undergrad in Mexico in oceanography, so I've been lucky enough to be studying the ocean since I graduated from high school, and it's been actually really rewarding. The first, and here I want to tell you a little bit what I do, what kind of instruments I use, and a little bit of why we do it. So this picture is a picture of getting ready to do a oceanographic cruise. I'm mostly an observational oceanographer. So that means I go out in research vessels, just like the one there, the Atlantic Explorer, and take samples and data from the ocean. So in this particular day, we are in the coast of Norfolk, Virginia, the East Coast. And in the dock, we see 2 gliders, which already they were mentioned. So these 2 ones are coastal gliders. They can go down to 200 meters. They measure temperature, salinity. They can also measure chlorophyll, oxygen, backscatter. The first one I think has a label. Yeah, this was our glider Bob. We name our gliders as Bob and Doug. Bob has another instrument strapped on it. That's an aqueduct. This instrument can measure velocities, and in this case, we can measure shear, which is how fast the velocity is changing vertically. And so we're getting ready to do a cruise, or getting ready for the boat to come in. To explain a little bit why we're going out there, so this is a satellite data. This is ocean temperature at the surface, observed by satellite data, and this is the Gulf Stream off the coast of the East Coast of the United States as it's shooting down to the west. Well, not shooting, flowing to the west. There we go. This is, so the map upstairs, you can see a little bit of where we are. So the Gulf Stream is this warm, salty water that is flowing to the east, and creates this strong front with the north slope water, which is fresh and really cold. So we can see that the contrast of the colors. And the flow does has a lot of variability. It meanders. It has eddies. Those scales are to 200 kilometers across. But most importantly, too, we have those small features. Maybe I can point with the. There we go. We have the small features over here, for example. Those can be 10 kilometers, 20 kilometers. So it's becoming, that's the new edge of oceanography, to be able to measure those patterns are so small scales. And the gliders and going with different specific instruments has helped us being able to observe those processes and understand them. And there are different ways that we can use technology to observe the ocean. The first one I'm showing here, it's another type of gliders. They're sea gliders. These ones can go down to 1,000 meters depth. They can be in the water to up to 6 months. So we can go there, deploy them, and then come back and communicate with them through our office. So these ones are getting ready to get deployed. They're in the dock also at Norfolk, Virginia. The second picture is actually here at the coast of Oregon. It's a mooring being deployed. So a mooring, it's actually staying fixed at the same place. So it's measuring how it's changing with time. So that's another way of also observing and trying to understand how something's changing through time. I don't have a picture, but we have drifters that move with the current and give us an idea of how fast the current is going, how fast it's changing in temperature, salinity. Together with these in situ measurements, we also have satellite data like the one I showed you before. So this one can really show us how different something is changing in space. And with several satellite information, we can see how it changes in time. So with this instruments and the tools of satellite, we really have a picture of space variability, time variability. Then we can also use models. Models help us understand the physics of the process, help us understand if we're getting the equations correctly, trying to experiment, getting them more and more complicated until we're able to replicate what we're seeing in the ocean. And the technology, the advances in technology and computer science has really led us to have models that are becoming higher and higher resolution and let us observe problems that are smaller and smaller in the ocean, like an example here. So through my graduate studies here, I have been able to work a lot with gliders. This is a picture of one of the end days of the cruise that I was mentioning before. So they were taking out the memory from the glider to get the data. And it's actually been really fun working with these instruments. And this one is Glider Bob. So for this cruise, we deploy them, and then they were doing transects, and we follow them around, and then using the information, because we can receive information from them out there in the water. They also help us to understand how to measure while we're in the boat, how fast to measure, where to go. So it's a nice cooperation, if that's the right word, between the gliders and the boat when we're doing the cruises. And just to show you a little bit of an example of the data. So coming back to Oregon, the map is the Oregon coast. We have the gray area, which is the coast, and if you focus at the red square, it's Newport. So that line that is going off the coast of Newport is a historic line that has been measured by OSU for more than 50 years with moorings and actually cruises that go and collect data. OSU has actually had a glider there, which I think is to 2006. So we have been continued trying to monitoring this line. And I have a little picture of a glider too. It's not a scale. The glider's not that big, but in the square there. So this is one of the pictures. This is one of the examples of the data that we get with the glider. So the first one is temperatures. The second one is salinity, and this of oxygen. And so we have depth on the y-axis, and we have longitude in the x-axis. So this is roughly around 80 to 90 kilometers distance from the shore. And so in the salinity plot, I'm put, again, not a scale, a glider going up and down. So this is what they do, right? They go down to 200 meters, come back, and after a couple of doing up and downs, they go to the surface, and we can communicate with them, and they can send us information, and then we can tell them, yes, good job, continue on your way. And the really good, one of the several advantages that gliders have is the high resolution data. So if you look, for example, at temperature, so this is it has like a resolution that is less than a kilometer along flow, so even 500 meters resolution, and we can see a lot of the variability at the mixed layer and see how it's changing. In salinity, we can look at the length of fresh water, which is probably telling us a story of what is happening in this region, which is fresh water coming from the river inputs. We also have a lot of alluvium and dissolved oxygen. We have the zone that has a little bit more variability as we go in with depth. And being able to observe this at this resolution and being able to be constantly in this coast at this resolution has really helped us understand the system at Oregon coast, seeing how upwelling affects, and this also impacts fisheries. So it's really important for the economy and the population in Newport. And actually for me, it's been really nice being able to work with them, trying to see and being able to figure out new problems that before using this technology, we were not able to see. Thank you. And I pass it back to Nalbab.
Thank you. I'll begin. I should not have called it Genesis. I should have entitled it Catalyst, because oceanography really started here with Wayne Burt in 1954 when he... Put the microphone up here. Oh, better? Is this better? I should have entitled that Catalyst. This is the quote that was the catalyst for Wayne Burt to really get to start a Department of Oceanography. And you can read it yourself. The point is the Navy finally woke up to the fact that we were falling way behind, particularly the Russians, because this was just after Sputnik, and realized of the government agencies, they had the responsibility. And so they bravely proposed a 10-OC program to be administered by the Office of Naval Research, which would support 10 departments or institutions of oceanography in the U.S. to, 1, build up the student body, and 2, to do fundamental basic research. And they promised they would fund it at an increasing level over 10 years, and thereby the name 10-OC became. And this is Wayne Burt's response to the notification. I think this may have been written the day after the Navy announced it. And it's true, oceanography in general, coastal oceanography out to 1,000 fathoms, that's a fathom is 6 feet, has been neglected. This is particularly true of our West Coast, where the Department of Oceanography and Scripps are far away from us, and of course hardly ever paid attention to the coastal oceanography of it. And he points out that Oregon State College, which we were still a college then, is in a unique position to do the research, which is of vital importance. And of course, one of the things you had to have if you're going to contribute to that, to learning about the ocean off the Oregon coast, is to have a vessel that can go to sea, is seaworthy, because you've got to go to sea in winter as well as summer. And this is the Okona. I would call it blessed, but it is no one who ever sailed on it would call it blessed Okona. It was notorious for rolling, and John can say more about that, but what you can imagine the problem with it. Wayne realized that diesel exhaust from the ships, oiled up from the exhaust of the ship, was a contributor to sea sickness. And I can vouch for that, because even after getting on a bus in a city like London or Chicago, you'd get a whiff of diesel fume from the buses, and the memory would come back of how seasick you got on our vessel. It was 80 feet overall. It carried 8 crew members and 7 scientists. The space was very tight. 4 bunks for the students and the seamen. There were 4 bunks in a tiny cabin. Only one of you could stand up to get your clothes on when you're changing into wetsuits, effectively. The first culprit that was noticed was Wayne believed that since the exhaust was a cause of seasickness, was to put the exhaust gas coming out of a very top of the mast. Well, you can imagine that was made of steel, significant weight, and contributed to the incredible rolling nature of it. And as it was 60 degrees is one roll that it had taken. And there's stories about people coming from one upper bunk to the lower bunk across the aisle just from a roll, which is true. I've been on it when it rolled 40 degrees. It was launched in May of 1961, and we gave it to the unsuspecting University of Alaska in May of 1964. It served well. It's the first vessel that we had any control over that could do the entire Newport line all the way out to 165 miles. The next one, please. And this is another feature of that time. Wayne hired June Petula, who was actually a Marine in the Second World War. She was a meteorological observer. She then got a degree in meteorology from the University of Chicago, then went to Scripps and got a master's degree and then a PhD under the famous Walter Monk, who is still alive. He just celebrated his 100th birthday. And when he found out that I had been a student and she was my research advisor, he says, "Oh, it's the biggest flattery I ever got. That makes you my scientific grandson." Anyhow, she was wonderful. She was the advisor she died, unfortunately, in 1972, so she's only here 11 years. She actually had 27 graduate students in that time. She was literally beloved by all of the students who were her advisor. She was my advisor. I was her first student, but a whole number of others got master's or PhD students, degrees from her. She was what was called in those days a descriptive physical oceanographer. Now people, that's with some of the basic questions being answered simply by making a lot of observations, but not understanding the full physics of it. It's now observational oceanography, like Ali has referred to. Let's see. She was well known. She was on the editorial board of Journal of Physical Oceanography, et cetera. Well, okay, let's put on the next slide. That helps. That will help me. This is a picture of how we investigated the ocean. The typical standard measurements made by a physical oceanographer, a descriptive oceanographer, the fundamental thing was measuring the seawater properties, namely temperature, salinity versus pressure. And that's a Nansen bottle, and on it there are reversing thermometers. When you put it on the wire and drop the messenger, you could number them on the wire, cocked, so to speak, and lower it. That was invented before the turn of the 18th and 19th century. On the side of the bottle were reversing thermometers. When you drop the messenger, it would release part of the upper part of the Nansen bottle, which would rotate. The thermometers on there, the mercury column would temporarily break off, and they were invented. The principle was invented by some very good glassblowers before the beginning of the 20th century. So back in 1890 or so, the Nansen bottle was invented by the Norwegian oceanographer Fridtjof Nansen, and that was invented just before the turn of the 18th to the 19th, to the 20th century, 19th to 20, 18, in both of them. To measure the salinity, one took water samples. The bottles closed at the depth where the Nansen bottle was reversed, and you could bring it up and you could take the water samples, And you would have to, in those days, and even probably in Mike Lohr's time, would have to measure the salinity by titration and get a measure of the chlorinity. Stommel has this wonderful quote from Stommel to show you that Oregon State was not the only institution that was behind. Nothing makes one more convinced of the inadequacy of present-day observing techniques than the tedious example of garnering a slender harvest of thermometer readers and water samples from a rather little ship at sea. A few good, determined engineers could revolutionize this backward field. That's very true. This was done in 1962, written by Hank Stommel at sea on the RV Argo, which I think was a Scripps vessel, a converted deep-sea tug from the Navy, off Somalia during the monsoon, southwest monsoon. Okay, the next picture is to show that our growing sophistication was the RV Aquinnah. Aquinnah was a beautiful ship. It was launched for the military in 1964, and it was ideal for oceanography. A number of institutions then took the ship and modernized it, and we spent almost as much money as the Navy did 20 years before, even counting for inflation, to make it right. It was beloved by us who did sail on it a lot, and it was large enough that we could do interdisciplinary science on it. It would hold something like 16 scientists that had a crew of, I think, like 18 officers and engineers and men, and that's served us until 1974 when the Okona came online, and it was the backbone of the Newport line studies. I think I ought to stop there. I've talked enough. I was going to show you, going to the direct measurements of currents, or which you could do by making moorings with current meters from the Aquinnah. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Bob. I'm Bob too. So in 1977, 41 years ago this week, humans first visited and sampled what's known as hydrothermal vents or hot springs on the seafloor. And OSU scientists helped lead the way in particular. Jack Corliss was the principal investigator, Jack Corliss on the faculty here in geology. He was the principal investigator on the dive program, and OSU scientists were there. And doing the arithmetic, discovered that I was there as a grad student, but I didn't quite fully realize that in 20 of 24 dives on that small vehicle there, the submarine Alvin, which carries 2 scientists, on 20 of 24 dives, OSU scientists were on board. And it's important because a lot of people, not just OSU, contributed to the knowledge and the execution of this cruise. And our colleagues at Woods Hole and our colleagues at Scripps and elsewhere were certainly there all the time, but we had a leadership role. I want to play briefly a recording.
Oh, wow.
This is Jack Corliss and John Edmond in the submarine, first running into these hot springs.
Lots of worm castings, large crabs.
And you hear everything he's describing are all the animals. Not, you have the hot water.
Oh, I can see shimmering water. Wait a
Comes
minute.
here.
Wait a minute. What is that?
Yeah.
There's water. I think there's shimmering water right over here to the left, coming out right off the top.
Okay, so this, the important thing here, this is a combination of exploration, which sounds a little bit unguided, but it was exploration to test hypotheses. And sometimes when you do that, you answer puzzles that were in your mind when you hypothesize the reason you should go there and look. And they knew they were looking for hot springs, and they'd been looking, the field had been looking for these all over the world beforehand, and this was the first successful discovery of that. But what they weren't anticipating, and this is another feature of exploration, is sometimes you run into something that you never imagined. And in fact, they ran into this huge pile of organisms, which, you know, it wasn't a basalt desert down there. It was a rich oasis, if you will. And there's one of the big clams in Jack's hand there as he comes back. Okay. Anyway, so discovery and ongoing research, this is Jack Corliss visiting us last year, has solved lots of puzzles about how the ocean chemistry works, the geology, and of course the biology. And this was a fundamental thing in our field, which dominated a lot of research for many years after. Over 1,000 literature citations branch away from this work. This led, so this is a picture of, in fact, what they found down there, lots of organisms. And it also led to an explosion of more research, and eventually found these hot springs didn't go over 26 degrees centigrade, sort of think room temperature. But we found vents up over 400 degrees centigrade eventually in basically every active ridge setting on the globe. But an amazing thing that shocked us all was the discovery that these ecosystems were based on chemosynthesis of bacteria and archaea, which takes reduced chemicals from the water, generates energy, and builds the whole organic matter ecosystem of these areas. And just a little ways away, you would find the same old vents that were now dead, but you wouldn't find all these organisms there. Okay, so that's the marine example. And then Jack Diamond here on the right and I began some unrelated research at Crater Lake initially in the early 80s. And we very quickly realized that we could see chemical traces and thermal traces in the bottom of Crater Lake, which John Byrne certainly had a lot to do with helping us understand the bathymetry of this caldera. And so in 88 and 89, Jack and I got funding to fly a one-person submersible into the lake and set up a field camp on Wizard Island and dove to explore the lake floor for hot springs. And it did, so Jack on the left in that beautiful photograph taken by an Oregonian diver, and me trying to figure out how to chew gum and drive a submarine at the same time. Right away, pretty much based on what we saw chemically and physically, we saw organisms, bacterial mats in fact, which in the marine system and in this system are the most visible diagnosis of something's going on here geochemically that bacteria are taking advantage of. Bacteria and archaea are really good at taking advantage of anything on Earth that they can yield energy. And I can't even imagine the number of places my colleagues are still finding that to be true. So it's not only those cases, searches for these vents are still ongoing here at the college and around the world. Bill Chadwick spoke to us last year. He's out at Newport, head of NOAA PMEL's Earth-Ocean Interaction Program. He's involved with lots of colleagues looking at amazing hydrothermal systems around the globe, especially the Western Pacific. Things like molten sulfur on the seafloor and liquid CO2 bubbles and just all sorts of amazing active, volcanism that you can see the lava pouring out. Andrew Thurber, ecologist who studies the biology of reducing systems that have low amounts of oxygen in them, and that includes vents, seeps of methane, all sorts of habitats. This is an important ongoing thing. Marta Torres, who specifically studies seepage at convergent margins, so more or less in the area on the far end of the plate conveyor belt where oceanic crust, we are looking at hot springs on one end where the plates are produced, and then on the other end where they converge on margins and other areas, there's more chemistry that goes on, and in particular releasing methane, which is the source of a lot of energy, and methane hydrates that white stuff in a marine sediment. And finally, there are exciting new ways of looking at hot springs. In this particular visual is axial caldera, an active volcano off the coast here. It is now instrumented as part of the Ocean Observatory's program with fiber optic cable and copper that runs over 20 instruments focused on vents, and they're always on, and you can observe them and get online. In the bottom right is a high definition camera watching a hydrothermal chimney and its organisms grow. I think it's actually dead right now, but stuff like that happens, right? See? Anyway, but it's changed from ship-based occasional research to being able to watch an oceanographic system in real time all the time. So with that, thanks, and we'll move on to Laurie.
All right, so moving from volcanoes off our coast to 1,000 miles away, thousands of miles away at the snow and ice covered top of the globe, I'm here to tell you a little bit about some work that some of us in the college are doing in the Arctic. And just to set the stage a little bit, I'm showing you some images that were produced from satellites tracking sea ice extent in the summer. And on the left we have the sea ice extent in the mid-'80s, and on the right we have the sea ice extent in 2012. And so you can see that there's quite a difference. And we've lost a little over a third of the sea ice in the summer. And you can see that the loss hasn't happened the same in all places. And one of the places where that loss is particularly severe, if I can get the pointer to come up, and just to orient you, this is the north coast of Alaska up here. So you can see that there's been a tremendous decline of seasonal sea ice in the summer just north of Alaska. And so one of the things we wanted to know is, how does this sea ice decline in the summer affect the ecosystem? And when you think of the Arctic, you might think of polar bears and walruses, and those are really important for drawing attention to the Arctic because they're pretty charismatic. We feel we can relate to them. But what we were interested in is how the loss of sea ice is impacting the bottom of the food chain. These tiny marine plants that supply the food for the whole ecosystem. And so you may not think they're charismatic, but I think they're actually quite beautiful, these little phytoplankton, because they're creating the whole food that's supplying this really rich and productive and dynamic environment. But, access to the Arctic is a little challenging because although there has been a loss of sea ice, there's still sea ice there. And so, you need special equipment to get up there. And so we were fortunate enough to be able to get ship time on a purpose-built vessel, the RV Sukuliak. Sukuliak in Inupiat means first-year ice. So this is a vessel that's capable of breaking very kind of thin first-year ice, which allows us to get into the Arctic and make some observations. And so a little map here on the left shows you generally where we were. We were in this region where it says 4, 5, 6. So we were studying this kind of north part of Alaska in this really productive shelf region. I was fortunate enough to lead this project along with some CO's colleagues, Miguel Goni and Burke Hale, who's also here today. And we were really fortunate enough to be able to take a lot of OSU undergrads with us through our 2 field seasons. So these are just some of the faces that were able to join us out in the field. And so you might ask, how do we track the growth of something that's invisible to the naked eye? Well, the first thing is we don't sleep. So I show you a picture of the clock here showing that we actually work around the clock. We set up shifts in teams, and we make, taking a big ship to the Arctic, as you can imagine, is an endeavor, and time is precious. And so we set up in teams so that we can work 24 hours a day and sample the environment. And some of the ways that we sample are shown here on the right. So this instrument here it's called a multi-core. So we basically ram it into the seafloor, and it collects a little stack of mud. We pull it out and take those little mud samples and bring them back to the lab here at OSU to analyze them. This instrument here is one of Burke's inventions. It's called the super sucker. He has very clever names for all his inventions. But this instrument we tow behind the ship, and it pumps water along this cable line back onto the ship, and we do a lot of chemical analyses on that water. And then this picture in the bottom is kind of the workhorse of oceanographic investigation. It's called a CTD, conductivity, temperature, depth. And all these little gray bottles are bottles that we can take water samples at depths that we sit in the lab and look at traces. There's sensors on this CTD, and we can decide where we want to take samples. The bottle snaps shut through a little connection we have with the ship, and then we bring it back up and we take all our little water samples. So we do that as well. And just to show you some of what it looks like on this ship, this is part of our lab space. So we basically bring a whole bunch of equipment and set up different analyzers, different ways of processing the water samples that we're bringing on board. So I'm going to stop talking and just show you a video that we put together from our second field season. And it'll show you a little bit about what it looks like here in action. Oops, if I can get it to go.
We have 2 different research groups here. We have Oregon State University and Virginia Institute of Marine Science. The whole goal is to see if productivity growth at the bottom of the food chain is changing during the late part of the season. We predominantly filter water samples that we collect both from an underway system, the super sucker system, as well as from CTD casks.
That water is pumped right back up here in the laboratory where we do a number of chemical analyses.
So we're measuring the partial pressure of CO2 gas in the seawater, different carbon species that are in the water. We're also doing the seawater nutrients, so we're measuring silicate, phosphate, nitrate, and ammonia.
While we're out here, our primary focus is to look at nitrogen fixation and to see how the local phytoplankton community is or is not using that source of nitrogen.
This builds on our work from last year, which focused on work that was about 30 miles offshore and farther, and this year we're focusing on 30 miles offshore and closer.
We are interested in finding out whether the same places where we found these amounts of carbon being produced are still occurring earlier in the year, and also because we'll be able to get much closer to land, we might be able to see more whether or not materials coming up from land, so nutrients and we're getting matter from land is actually making it out to the coastal ocean.
I believe it's important because knowing what chemicals there is in the water pretty much determines the health of the ocean.
The drive to understand it is what keeps us coming back. Maybe I can help someone down the road, you know, where productivity may be happening and how the world may be changing around them.
So what my colleague Rachel said is true. The drive to understand the system and how it's changing is what keeps us coming back. But there are some personal rewards as well. For me, to be able to experience this environment that so few people get to see is really rewarding. You know, we were fortunate enough to be able to walk on sea ice floes while we were out there, see colonies of walrus, see the northern lights, drive around in a small boat among these ice floes. So it's a really rich area to work, and for me, it's very personally rewarding as well. So with that, I will leave you with one of our special moments from our 2016 cruise.
Good morning. I'm going to preface my remarks by saying that there was nothing glamorous about my job of 28 and a half years with the OSU Marine Extension Service. I was charged with working educationally with a group of hardworking, gritty, independent, tough fishermen, many of whom initially had no use for the government, and that included OSU. But let's back up a few years to Christmas Eve, 1966. Two OSU faculty members, Dr. Howard Horton from the Department of Fish and Wildlife, and Bill Wick, who was an agricultural extension agent in Tillamook County, huddled right here on campus and cranked out a proposal to get funding to establish the first marine extension position in the state. Now, extension had had a big presence in this state and a lot of other states with land-grant universities, with extension offices in all 36 counties. But none of the 7 coastal counties offered anything for the marine industry, and that included fishermen, of course, and seafood processors and others. They didn't apply to Sea Grant, and Sea Grant had been funded by Congress, or at least passed by Congress earlier that year, but instead went to another federal program called the State Technical Services Act for funding. Both Bill and Howard called me at about the time they submitted the proposal and asked me whether I was interested in taking the job if, as a matter of fact, they received the funding to get that position. I said I certainly was. I wanted to get back to the coast. At that time, I was working in a rather innocuous job with the old, what was then Oregon Fish Commission, analyzing scales, looking through a microscope 8 hours a day, and that's not Bob Jacobson. So I was tickled to death for them to have asked me that, and the phone call actually came, mid-May, 6 months later, when Howard called me and he said, "Are you still interested in that job?" I said, "I'd love it, love to get back to the coast." He said, "When can you go to work?" So I said, "Well, give me a couple weeks to wrap up what I'm doing here." He said, why don't we meet in the extension office in Corvallis so you can talk to some of the extension people on June 8th, and then we'll proceed to Newport. So without so much as an interview with other than the director of the extension division and a couple of his top administrators, I got the job. Didn't have to, I don't know what it is today, but my guess is today you're escorted around campus for a couple of days giving all kinds of talks, but that wasn't the way it was then. That started a 28 and a half year career with OSU, as I said, working with Oregon commercial fishermen. Now those first few days, weeks, even months were, I wondered to myself whether I'd really bitten off more than I could chew. Here I was, new kid on the block, charged with providing an education to a group of pretty tough, hardworking, independent guys. And I knew nothing about commercial fishing, and nor did I know any commercial fishermen. So that all changed, and it's kind of interesting in my mind the way it changed. In my introduction, you heard that I was a basketball player here at Oregon State, and I had a chance to meet some of the younger guys involved in fishing when I first went to Newport. Terry Thompson was one of them. He's now a Lincoln County Commissioner. But at that time, he was a student here at Oregon State who fished salmon commercially during the summer. Terry had been a big basketball fan and recognized me from my days of playing hoops here at OSU, as did a number of the other younger guys in the fishing industry there in Newport. So within that first 6 months, I got invited to go on fishing vessels, salmon fishing, albacore fishing, trawling for bottom fish, Dungeness crab. They became my mentors. They became my teacher. I became the student. But that was a tremendous education for me that those young fishermen, and to some extent some of the older guys, provided. I went for the first couple months with nobody visiting in my office, nobody dropping by to talk to me, very few phone calls. And that all changed when the word kind of got out up and down the coast that Bob Jacobson was based in Newport and he was here to help the industry. It was obvious after the first 6 months or so that I was going to need some help. I couldn't continue to cover the entire coast from Brookings to Astoria, trying to respond to all the questions and issues that I'd get from industry. That help came in the form of a fellow by the name of Barry Fisher. Barry was a big, swashbuckling high school dropout, Korean War veteran, Harvard graduate, who was fishing on the East Coast when he saw a proposal from the OSU Department of Fish and Wildlife for a new position as a commercial fishing gear specialist. Barry arrived on the scene sometime in late '68 or maybe early '69 and immediately went to work. Really a hard worker, very smart guy. He left his mark on the industry very positively, I might add. And actually, Barry didn't last long, maybe 4 or 5 years, and probably had a greater positive impact on the industry after he retired from the university than he did while he was there. Then in pretty rapid fire succession, and the Sea Grant program was then in effect. We didn't become a Sea Grant university or college at that time until 1971, but Sea Grant funds became available, and the Extension Service hired marine extension agents for both Astoria and Coos Bay, and both of those individuals came from fishing families, so they had a great background. At about the same time, the Marine Science Center was, I think that was officially opened in 65, was developing a nice public education program, and we hired Don Giles to head our public information program there at the Science Center. And one of Don's saying, he was one of my favorite faculty guys. One of his sayings remains in effect today, whale watching spoken here. If you drive the Oregon coast, you see those little signs. That originally came from Don Giles. And then we hired Ken Hildebrand, a seafood processing specialist, to work with the processors, and Vicki Osis, who worked with school groups. And all of us were really besieged with requests from school groups all over the state to come talk to them about the marine industry. Couldn't possibly handle all those requests. By the time we got to the mid-70s, we were probably staffed with, I don't recall for sure, but someplace between 12 and 15 FTEs. We had specialists in oceanography, marine economics. Gwyl Evans was our publication specialist. We had an excellent program, and the increase in the size of our program correlated with really the expansion of the commercial fishing industry. When I first got there, the fleet was characterized by mostly wooden vessels of under 50 feet, just a Spartan electronic component in the wheelhouse, and they fished primarily near shore. But about the time I got there, things started to change. Boats got bigger, more horsepower, became more efficient. Regulators became concerned about too much effort on too few fish, so new regulations were imposed. And really one of the roles we played early on was to try to be the facilitator between the industry and regulators when it came to implementing new regulations. I'm not naive enough to think that we had a huge impact on the fishing industry, but I do know that we probably helped them during the process of their expansion become more effective, more efficient, and become the modern industry they are today. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, and I'm happy to be the first non-Bob up here to talk. I actually considered changing my names, but they said 3 Bobs was enough. So I want to preface that you know, we were asked to tell ocean stories, and a lot of my ocean stories aren't that shareable, and so I had to think about how to do this, and you know, this is going to be my ocean story, but I wanted to really point out that, you know, at CEOS we're unique in a number of ways, and one of the things that we do, you know, I believe better than anybody else, is that we build things. We build the tools that allow us to observe and understand the ocean. Excuse me. And what's more, we do that without a lot of the resources that some of the maybe more well-known ocean institutions have. You know, so we're sort of the MacGyvers of oceanography. We can put things together with less and in creative ways that might surprise you. Now, my personal ocean story. Didn't want to do that. My personal ocean story. My personal ocean story started 30 years ago, which means that I'm no longer the oldest of the young guys. I'm one of the youngest of the old guys. And this is what happened in October of my senior year in college. I was at the University of Washington as a chemical engineer, and eagerly looking forward to never being on a college campus again and getting a job somewhere, which at that time probably meant an oil refinery in Pascagoula, Mississippi. And then this happened to the stock market. Stock market crashed almost 25% in one day. All of the big companies stopped hiring, and I thought, what am I going to do? And you know what I thought? Well, what do I like to do? Well, I'd like to build stuff. And you'll notice, among other things, I was realizing when I put this together that, you know, I like to build stuff that gets me out and catching things, and you might decide later that I've got food issues here, but most of what I was naturally inclined to do was build things that got me out into, you know, some of the nicest places on Earth, and, you know, to partake in activities that let me bring something back. Now, most of my focus was on things that, you know, filled my freezer, but I started thinking about what else could I do that maybe would let me turn this into something semi-professional, and I started thinking about environmental sciences and oceanography in particular, and how that might let me get into these kinds of places. I may have put too many of these slides in here, but I'm going to make up for some lost time here in a minute. So what could I do? Well, we looked at what kind of things we could do to help observe the ocean better. What could we build that would give us more information, more effectively, more efficiently, and we started to put things together like this. And a lot of what we do is very fine and detailed work. and we produce instrumentation that goes in laboratories and can go at a number of places like this that's very detailed. This is actually what inspired the name of the Burkelator. But these are laboratory manipulations where we started to look at organismal response to chemistry. But sometimes we do things that aren't so precise, aren't so fine, and this leads us to this whole other issue of how we get this technology into the ocean. And Roberta was talking about how we can do oceanography from our living rooms. I'm not quite there yet. So I like to get out on the boats and do the work in the ocean. And this is sort of a montage of some places that you'll recognize, of course, of us getting out there to do this work. And some days this is how it looks out the porthole. Some days this is how it looks. And so we get out there in the ocean and we start getting our gear in the water, which is often challenging once it's out there. We've got to maintain it. We've got to get out once in a while to fix the things that break. We've got to get it back on board. And this is actually a fairly nice day, and it still looks a little motion sickness inducing here. I don't know, how are you doing, Bob? Could bring out some diesel smoke for you. But this just gives you a sense of the kind of, the merging of very detailed analytical work that we do with the heavy hands-on, real blue-collar, Carhartt and hard hat kind of work that bridges that gap between the sensitive analytical work that we do and actually bringing home the data. This is the super sucker coming back on board. We often bring back more than data, but this is what it looks like on the shipboard side. And with lots of long nights, this is our TV dinner operation here. I don't have food issues. But the data comes in, and it just comes screaming in. The data rates that we're able to do with these technological developments are fantastically higher than the old school oceanography, and we can look at a number of parameters and species in resolutions that were almost unheard of before. Word got out about this, and it got out to the aquaculture industry and asked whether or not we could help, and it turned out we could, and we've been working very hard with the local shellfish growers and even the I don't have food issues. And even the sea salt factories, and that brought us to a whole new category of deployment environments that let us get into. Excuse me, I should have done the Sudafed before the talk. Let us get into a whole new suite of some of the most gorgeous places on Earth. This is Quadra Island, the head of, it's up by Campbell River. And let me back this up a little bit here. The new project that Roberta alluded to earlier is this new wave energy testing site. And this is brand new. It's still schematic in concept. And the idea here is that Oregon's coastal waters have a tremendously energy-dense wave field, and the ability to harvest energy from the waves is unique here, and our access to the ocean, because of the marine infrastructure that we have in Newport, is unique. And wave energy, the waves don't set. Waves keep going even when the wind stops blowing. And so the wave energy generation potential is huge here, and we have the technology with a number of researchers that have worked on this to provide a testing bed. And so what we'll do here is build the test bed that will let the commercial scale developers bring their devices out and test them in the wave field. And we'll provide the grid connected infrastructure and the marine support to hopefully turn this into something that's about where wind energy was 20 years ago to something like where wind energy is today. This is one example of an energy harvesting device, and where we'll actually bring this cable ashore is at Driftwood Beach down in just north of Waldport, and I'll leave it with that. Thanks.
I saved the oldest dinosaur for last. It's been been interesting to listen to the comments, particularly Bob Smith and Bob Collier and Jake. I wanted to add little asides. The ship, the Aquinnah, was a World War II vessel. It was converted, and it was a wonderful conversion. That was one thing. But anyway, I wrote a paper a number of years ago called Oceanography, a Catalyst for Change at Oregon State University. And what you have been hearing from these gentlemen and these ladies, should be ladies and gentlemen, shouldn't it, are some of the things that represent change. Wayne Burt came to Oregon State University in 1954. Now, you may not remember, but the Soviets didn't put a satellite up until 1957. There were none of the sophisticated devices that you've seen. Bob Smith showed you a Nansen bottle on a line, and that Nansen bottle was the way, and the reversing thermometers, and you didn't show a bathythermograph, another World War II device, with the things that were being used by oceanographers in those days. In 1954, Wayne Burt came to Oregon State after he had been turned down at the University of Oregon. And he had talked to his colleagues who had been at Scripps when he was there about support from the Office of Naval Research. The Office of Naval Research was created in 1946 because they began to recognize during World War II that we needed information about the ocean if we were going to fight a battle in the ocean. The National Science Foundation didn't come around until 1950. But in any case, Wayne came here with a promise from some of his friends at ONR that they could probably support him. And so he went to the Dean of Science, a man named Francois Gilfillan, and Gilfillan said, well, let me talk to the boss. And the boss was Augustus Leroy Strand, A.L. Strand, the president of Oregon State, or Oregon State College in those days. And they said, well, it's not going to cost us anything. You suppose you can find an office or a desk for this guy in the General Science Department? And I said, sure. So in 1954, Wayne Burt came, and you had to know Wayne. Wayne was a hard charger. You give him a foot, he'll take a yard. You give him a yard, he'll take the half a mile. But Wayne really wanted an oceanography program in his home state, which was Oregon. And so by the time 1959 rolled around, they had manufactured this proposal to the Board of Higher Education to set up an oceanography department. I came here in 1960 to interview for a job in the oceanography department. There was nothing. The oceanography department's office were in the food science building. Food science, come on, guys. I got off the plane, and we had commercial flights into Corvallis in those days. So I went and got off the plane, and it was probably May or something like that. It was clear. You could see Mary's Peak, and Wayne's little blue Simca automobile smelled like mildew. And I thought, yes, it does rain in Western Oregon, doesn't it? In any case, 1959, the department had been created, and so I came in as one of the first faculty members in 1960. 1961, you've seen the Okona. Yeah, and you've heard how terrible it was. It's the only ship I've ever been seasick on. And the problem with the Okona was that, and Bob has mentioned it, it rolled 60 degrees from the vertical. 60 degrees. Can you stand up under that? I don't know whether you could or not. But in any case, it was a roller, and it didn't last long at Oregon State. Because we replaced it with the Aquinnah, which was a much better research vessel. But in any case, when we had the Okona, it was moored at the city dock in Newport, and we had to pay rent for that mooring on the city dock. And so Wayne was constantly looking for a new spot where, with a proposal, we might get money from the National Science Foundation for a ship facility Didn't happen. We got money for a new building, which was called the Oceanography building, until we renamed it Burt Hall. But in any case, we're looking for a dock in Newport. And without success, until the federal government created a new program called the Area Redevelopment Administration. And ARA, as it was called, was designed to provide money for depressed areas, to stimulate the economy and so on. In 1963 or 4, Georgia Pacific in Toledo laid off something like half of their employees, and that immediately plunged Lincoln County into being the #1 depressed area in the state of Oregon. The governor, a man named Mark Hatfield, at that time said, well, is there anything we can do to stimulate the economy in Lincoln County? And so he got the chancellor of the state system of higher education and asked him, is there anything you guys can do down there to stimulate the economy? Well, the chancellor passed the word down to the presidents of the institutions, and at Oregon State, Wayne Burt was right on it. He said, you bet. We can build a marine science center with a ship facility. And the Marine Science Center opened in 1965. The whole thing cost less than $1 million. Can you imagine that today? But in any case, 1965, the Marine Science Center was created for 2 reasons. To create new jobs for people in Lincoln County and to attract tourists. Don Giles was mentioned as somebody that worked with Jake. Don Giles was hired at the Marine Science Center for educational programs, extension programs, and so on. But when that center opened in May of 1965, we realized that if you could keep a family at the center in the afternoon, they couldn't get out of Oregon that day. And that was more money for the state of Oregon. That was well received by a lot of people. Well, in any case, that really helped to develop the extension program that was not formally named that at the time down in Newport. Now, as time was going on, second thing that happened was that the Atomic Energy Commission of the United States was looking for places to build reactors. And they got the bright idea that the shallow shelf off the East Coast, continental shelf, might be a good place if they could build islands out there and put the reactors on the islands. Now, nobody would object on shore that there was a nuclear reactor next door and so on. And so they came up with a proposal to do this. A man named Howard Hinsdale was the president of Umpqua Navigation. Well, Umpqua was the company that built the jetties along the Oregon coast. And the method that Umpqua used was to get huge blocks of basalt and place them in an interlocking way to create these jetties. And if you want to see that, just go down to Newport and walk out on the jetty. And so anyway, Howard had an idea, but he had to demonstrate that his way of building jetties was better than anybody else's. And so he went to the Corps of Engineers and said, we want to do these tests in your wave tank. Will you let me do this test? And they said no. Well, there wasn't any other wave facility in the United States where Howard could get his method of building jetties developed. And so he said, well, wait a minute. They got an oceanography program at Oregon State, was the university by then, at Oregon State University. I bet if I go to them, they might do it. And they even have an engineering program, the only one in the state. So Howard came to us and he said, I want a wave tank and I want to test my way of doing it. We said, okay, Howard, we'll build the wave tank for you. You give us the money for it. And whatever the results of the studies are, that's what we're going to publish. And so Hinsdale took a chance on building a wave tank at Oregon State University. And fortunately, we had 2 faculty members in engineering at this point who were interested in doing this. guy named Jack Nath and another one named Larry Slaughter. And so they began to build this tank. Well, the tank, as I recall, was 132 feet long and 12 feet deep in most places and 15 feet deep in one of the deeper spots. And it was out in the field. There was no building around it. It was just out in the field with a trailer kind of facility with equipment and so on to record what the waves were doing. The biggest problem they had was they wanted to build what's called a random wave, where the wave would be different heights and so on. And they had to have a wave machine, which no one had ever built before. And so they built one. It didn't leak, and they managed to get this thing going. And so the wave tank started. Well, this would not have happened if we hadn't had an oceanography program at Oregon State, something that Wayne Burt started thinking about in 1954. 1966, it's already been mentioned, the National Sea Grant College Act was passed. In 1968, Oregon State was one of the first 3 institutions to get a grant from the Sea Grant College program. Again, probably wouldn't have happened without oceanography. 3 years later, it was designated one of the first 4 Sea Grant colleges in the United States. Now, by this time, we're into the 1970s. And it's already been mentioned, I think Roberta mentioned it. There are 2 major programs that happened in the 70s. First was IDOE, the International Decade of Ocean Exploration. And without that, we wouldn't have had the big projects. The biggest thing for us was one of the first projects was the coastal upwelling program. Where better to study coastal upwelling than off the coast of Oregon? And this gentleman right over here was one of the principal investigators of that. Oceanography was getting bigger and bigger and bigger. 1972, for a variety of reasons, the department was designated as a school. I was chairman of the department at that time, and so the president, who was, what'll I say, economical, said, okay, Byrne, you're the dean. And all that changed was reporting. But now we were a school. We were in competition with other schools. I think a few years later they changed the designation from school to college. Is that Bill Percy over there? There's another one of the pioneers. It came a week after I did in 1960. Good to see you, Bill. We're at this point. We've got a marine science center, which wouldn't have happened without oceanography. We've got a ship support facility down there as part of that activity. We have a wave tank, which the Navy is about to recognize as a center of excellence for wave research. Subsequently became a tsunami center supported by the National Science Foundation. All of this would not have happened had it not been for, well, it might have happened, but not when it did. The organization of the university began to change. Oceanography in School of Oceanography, 72, College of Oceanography in 1983. I'm looking to see when atmospheric sciences was added. Can't remember. But anyway, it became the College of Ocean and Atmospheric Sciences. Geology was still in the College of Science, but not for long, because it was going to be moved over so that we had a college that had earth science, ocean science, and atmospheric science. If the university had had astronomy, I'm convinced we would have had the astronomy program too. But it was very clear by this time that oceanography was a catalyst for change in so many, many ways. We needed space. So buy up, convince the administration that we need those houses on Orchard Street and so on. Those houses, which are now parking lots, I guess, maybe they're not even parking lots, they're new buildings, were the way oceanography got the reputation for being a space muncher. In any case, you get some sense of the changes that are taking place. Oceanography, College of Oceanography, College of Ocean and Atmospheric Sciences, College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences. And then I think about 3 or 4 years ago, they decided we ought to have a Marine Studies initiative for the whole university. And that sounds revolutionary, but a lot of that stuff had started in the 60s and 70s, and it was now put together in a significant way. So it's very clear that without the oceanographic efforts at Oregon State University, it would be a very, very different university today. And it has made a major contribution over the years, not just to Oregon State University, but to the whole concept of ocean science and our knowledge of the oceans. It's hard to know where you go from here, but you are all change makers. And just as my colleagues and I were change makers at the time. Thank you.
Okay, so where do we go from here? We still need more space, more facilities, more buildings, so that we can do more great things. And I do think that the overview that you got today, going through the past and looking toward the future, indicates that there's still a lot more work to be done, a number of discoveries to be made, and many of those discoveries will certainly fall into the realm of sort of basic exploration and fundamental knowledge, but many of them will be in service to some of the significant environmental challenges that we're facing as a state, as a nation, and indeed as a planet. I would like to open this up to questions from the audience, since we've had quite a lot of podium time here, and to see if anyone wants to ask any of our panelists any questions or about their perspectives, their experiences, and looks like we have one.
Thank you. This has been a marvelous exploration of ocean science here at OSU. I'm wondering if any of the panelists could talk about the differences they see in students coming to the university today compared to what students were like in 1960.
Well, that would fall to you two gentlemen. Okay, you had Bob first. Okay, which Bob?
Since I was one of the few people in physical oceanography at the time, as soon as I passed my comprehensive exams, not the thesis, but the comprehensive exams, I was asked to start teaching a whole bunch of courses, and having a master's degree in physics. They threw most of the physical curricula. Without June Petula did the very introductory ones, but I found myself having to teach marine hydrodynamics. I am a descriptive physical oceanographer, and so on. The students who came when we first began teaching classes, the first level graduate classes, we were inundated with students from all over the university, because oceanography was the new thing on campus. And we actually had to end up and having two sections of the introductory physical oceanography class, because one, we got it finally to be, you could either take it as a graduate student or an undergraduate, and the undergraduates, typical class size was 80 students, and I, for 1 year only, had to teach both sections, and so we designated one for graduate students and got a big G name attached to it, and the other was undergraduates. The students seemed really eager to learn something about new science. I think any other new science coming in would have gotten that response, but since we have an ocean here, they seem to write better than they do today. That was the biggest note, but they were as eager as any students that I don't teach undergraduates now, so I can't really make a distinction.
I think one of the big differences and built on the strong foundation of our research oceanographers, for a long time we were teaching what we'd like to call clones of ourselves, people who fed the existing oceanography hierarchy. They generally went off and got PhDs and became our analogs here or somewhere else. But because of the need, and we saturated the academic system, but more so I like to think because of the demand for professionals who understood the environment but had a vision of doing something quite different than what we were doing in the university for a living. They went out and in our marine resource management program and elsewhere, they started working all around the globe. And today you find people throughout the world, certainly a lot of people in South America. If you look at the Oregon's programs that the legislative programs that deal with fisheries and stuff, it's populated by students from this college who are leading the way in regulations between Oregon and Washington and California. So I guess the biggest thing I see is people, our students are going into a lot of other things. They come in younger, they may leave with a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, and do great things. We still have great PhD students, but it's much more diverse now.
Well, I don't think there's anything I can add to that, really. I think today's students, in many ways, much more sophisticated, but not necessarily any smarter than the students were in the old days. The whole technology has changed significantly from the mechanical oceanographer to the electronics oceanographer, if I can use that term. We had nothing. We navigated by LORAN. There were no satellites, and one of the big contests between institutions when who can get the first satellite locator, and it took 53 minutes to get a spot that might have been as accurate as 1.5 miles, whereas LORAN you were just guessing where you were. So a lot of changes.
That's a good thing. I'd like to also...
Roberta, we have another question over here. We have another question.
Oh, okay.
You can respond to that if you wish. Okay. I was wondering, speaking of catalysts and about June Pluto's experience that led her to the work that she did, do you necessarily feel that World War II and the introduction that lots of people otherwise wouldn't have to experiencing time on the coast and in the ocean, and possibly even an opportunity or a motivation to go to college that they didn't have before, that World War II was a catalyst into ocean research in the academic community?
So the question was whether World War II and the scientific activity that came after that was a real catalyst for people, including female scientists, to get into oceanography. So not just from the scientific investment point of view, but from the educational point of view.
I can say just one anecdote. Certainly June Petula was such a fine person. That certainly attracted local women or women who knew her from somewhere to consider that career. The other thing, the fact that a lot of people had experienced the military and were interested in it is partly the reason I ended up in oceanography here. I had gotten a master's degree at the University of Oregon in physics, And our major professor, 3 of us, had been terminated, told he wasn't going to get tenure. And we didn't know what to do because this was the middle of the year. We all had just finished our master's degree. I came up here to Oregon State to visit one of the University of Oregon's new PhDs who had been a Navy officer. And he looked at us and said, "You've all got master's degrees in physics? You ought to go see this guy, Wayne Burt." This is in the very early spring of 1960. And you ought to go see Wayne Burt because he's looking for people with a physics background. And the rest is history for me. I think the fact that there were people who knew about the ocean, who had experienced the ocean either as military people or just Victory at Sea was a popular program in those days too, would think about it.
Does OSU and your college specifically recruit graduate students? And if so, how do they do it? We've heard about individuals looking for people, but does the school actively recruit graduate students? And if so, how?
Sure, I'll take that question. We do, so there's both active and passive recruitment. There's a lot of word of mouth through colleagues where, you should go work with so-and-so. If you have experience with somebody in oceanography or in an allied field, then there's a lot of referral. And what I find very interesting about oceanography is there aren't very many undergraduate programs in oceanography. And so it's not necessarily a logical step from what you do as an undergraduate to going into graduate school. And there are many, in fact, several of the people on this podium, who here has an undergraduate degree in oceanography? Just one. Everybody comes from somewhere else. I came from a biology program. And so it's definitely a lateral move for a lot of people, and some of that is built on connections with undergraduate advisors who propel you through their own personal relationships with others. And then we do active recruiting through advertising, through going to scientific meetings and trying to talk to people who might be interested in pursuing a graduate degree in oceanography. We do outreach to high schools to introduce students to the field of oceanography, thinking that we do have undergraduate programs. Maybe they'll come in, maybe they'll stay. We also have undergraduate research experience programs where we bring students in for the summer, and they kind of get their feet wet. And sometimes they get their feet wet on a vessel because we do have resources to take them to sea. And that's kind of, they get the bug bite there. And sometimes they come back to us, sometimes they go to other places. The overall field has been sort of declining in the numbers of graduate students, and that might be, part market forces, part the fact that there are a lot of employment opportunities for master's students, and so they leave and go out and work in the government or private sector rather than stay on for a PhD. But there is quite an active program. Any other questions? Sure. You want to take that?
So, there are a number of describe the projects we're working on. The college is working on so many different projects, and almost all of them are, almost all of them are driven by basic research, fundamental science questions. And so often what we end up doing is something that serves our purpose for science, but ultimately someone else outside of the scientific realm starts to wonder if we can do something for them. And the big difference, I think, between how this might have worked maybe in the time when Bob was working with the fishing community is that the entire economy has become sort of an information economy, right? And so, what I transitioned from was, filling my freezer to filling a hard drive. And what people are using is the knowledge, just the basic understanding of the environment that they're in is allowing them to make economic and professional decisions that they wouldn't have unless we were providing that information to them in sort of near time and in an accessible format. And so what came out of my work with some of the instruments that I built entirely for basic research purposes was that I could monitor ocean acidification conditions in coastal settings where a lot of the classical measurement approaches just wouldn't work. And so what we were able to do was to put that into the shellfish hatcheries where they could identify when conditions were unfavorable, when they were favorable, and they would make their decisions about when they would spawn, when they would try to mitigate the conditions in the water. And effectively the shellfish industry was on the brink of collapse about 8 years ago. And by using this information, they're back to about 80% of where they were before. As far as whether or not things are getting commercialized, we're still, that's not really what we do. I build instruments in the back of my garage and sell a couple a year, but the economy of scale really isn't with us to the point where we can put these out in every environment without the technical support to really get that going. So we work on that, but it's really not what drives our basic research.
I think I want to redirect that just a little bit to underscore the fact that, as we've learned more about the ocean and its connection to the atmosphere and the connection to terrestrial environments, we realize how much more interconnected the ocean is with many of the things that we depend on, like oxygen and food and other things. And so the knowledge that we produce, I think, is much broader in its relevance. Made evident by the fact that we know more about these interconnections. And so then it becomes a question of how do you put that in the hands of people that need the information? And so I actually want to ask you, Bob, what's the best way for us to work with communities to get our information out to the people who need it?
Thank you. Actually, I think that my daughter, Katie, who now has my old job as Marine Extension Agent in Newport, and she just informed me yesterday she'd been there for 15 years, helped put together a program where industry members from all along the Oregon coast, but primarily Newport, get together periodically with some of your researchers to talk about some of the areas where they might jointly collaborate. And I think several programs have come out of those talks and will continue to in the future. So that's one possible way that that interaction might take place.
Yes. Microphone coming your way.
Maybe.
I'm kind of taken with each of your stories. And so I'm curious if anybody is documenting the institutional knowledge that all of you have, especially particularly the last gentleman who stood up and has this really historical data of our university and the oceanography program. Has anybody documented those stories?
Yes, so the question was somewhat in reference to your talk as to whether or not anyone was documenting not just the history of the institution, which you've certainly devoted some time to, but I think more specific to the stories that are being told.
My answer would be buy my book. A lot of that's documented. Also, Louise Burt, Wayne Burt's widow, wrote a history of the first 20 years, I think it was, of oceanography at Oregon State. So there are a number of documents that are in existence. Bob Smith and I were responsible somewhat earlier for putting together a book for the San Diego Museum in their book, Main Hall, and this is to be about the pioneers in oceanography, in this particular case, Oregon State. And Jack Barth, who now heads up the Marine Studies Initiative, has a major article here on the state of technology at that particular time. I think, Bob, you were also co-author on that one.
I grew up with my dad as an oceanographer at Scripps, and knew all the fish and knew all the divers with shark bites and stuff. So I remember my dad talking about some research projects of releasing energy from the ocean depths by pushing the warm water down to the bottom. And he said it was scrapped by oil and gas industries. Are you having any, or government pressure or something because they didn't want a cheap energy source? Are you having any problems with that? Is there any way to know if you are? Because the ocean has tremendous energy.
Right.
Yes.
So I think the technology you're talking about is thermal gradient energy generation, and there are a number of folks that are exploring that, particularly in Hawaii. But I would have a hard time. It'd be bad for my career to get up and say that the government is not supporting ocean energy when they just gave us $50 million to support ocean energy. So we're not seeing signs of that, right? So the ocean energy, wave energy in particular, is almost entirely federally supported. There's no evidence that the government is suppressing this. I mean, funding is bad, but it doesn't appear to be bad for alternative energy.
Yes.
So I observed this at a retirement for Waldorf, and I talked about it at the table with people I was sitting with. But from my perspective, there seems to be a higher than average collegiality within the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences. And I was curious if you would agree and why you think that is. Is it because of cruises to the Arctic? What brings that on?
Well, I think everyone here can speak to that. But anybody want to go first?
I think Wayne Burt and John Byrne and some of the first faculty members here really encouraged us to be decent to one another. I know other institutions where the competition, even at the professional level, was fairly intense. And comment a couple of, I think it's now going on to 20 years ago, NSF did a random, ordered by Congress to do a random evaluation of how good they are about saying how well the programs are picked up. So they sent 3 people to Oregon State picking random projects, and they chose oceanography. And Jack Barth and my program was one of them that was chosen. And so they sent somebody who's good in finances, somebody in social stuff, and a scientist. This was a geochemist. And they chose one of our projects, and I think one of Kelly Faulkner's programs. And what they did is to come and interview us and also interview our students by themselves, by our technicians by themselves, and then the PIs by themselves, and asked them questions and wanted to see evidence. It was sort of like a grand jury. And I remember I had the fortune of having been overseas, and I came back at the last day they were here, but they wanted to see me, so I met them 7 in the evening, and we went on and talked, just the science one. And he said, I have a couple of questions that really struck me after talking with your colleagues and the people working for you and all the students in the computers systems that you have for oceanography. And one thing that amazes me is, one, this is the first institution we've been to where we didn't have complaints about the computer system. And that was, we had our own, independent from the university as such. And they said also the technicians who were met separately didn't have any gripes about the working conditions, and they seemed to get along uniquely well. And there was and the students didn't have any complaints. And I think it was partly the whole thing, and I got my PhD here, and coming up, there were very few toxic people. I only can think of one here in my career here, which is unusual, because you go to Scripps and other institutions, and you hear a lot of backbiting. And they said, can you explain why? And I said, well, I have the vantage point of seeing it from the beginning. And we were all encouraged to get together. In fact, when we were very small, we all had to go out the ship together. There were not enough technicians to support the stuff. So we would go on a cruise with biology or with the chemical oceanographers, that. And so there was, from the beginning, and I think that's a case where the culture is sort of just continues. This is the way it's done here. I remember we had some very good technicians working for Jane Heyer and me, extremely good. And people would, the other technicians would feel free, and we encouraged them to do that, to come if they had a question they knew that person could answer. And pretty soon, with some very rare exceptions, we'd find that some equipment of ours was lent to somebody studying biology, or lent to somebody else. And that sharing was astounding. And I think that's a cultural thing that just comes, and I attribute that to people like Wayne Burt, certainly, John Byrne, and that we came up as a family. And I think that just has continued. I hope it's continuing now.
Let's find out. Ale? That's a tricky question. I think something that I like about OSU, and my perspective is from oceanography, as a physical oceanography, so I have to acknowledge that part too. There's definitely an open door. You can go to any door, you can ask anybody, you can collaborate if you talk to somebody. I think because we have becoming a bigger college, it's been hard to sometimes cross those barriers of talking to people who are from other degrees. So I know my close circle of oceanography, physical oceanography, yeah, it's really collaborative, not competitive with my other friends of grad school. Hearing other stories from other institutes, it is different. But slowly, it's been for me slower to get to know people from geography or from geology. And I think just because of the history of how slowly the college has been unite them. But I do believe is one of the goals of the college to start making those connections, start finding research that's collaborative between oceanography, geography, geology, MRM, finding spaces, and I think MS Marine Studies Initiative, this is one of the goals, finding spaces where all those degrees can become together. But I think it's still, sometimes the way we are taught classes is like, this is the class and this is the area of expertise, and you become like this, almost like not narrow-minded, but we try to just look at our own area. And I think it is a personal, goal to start looking with other people and talking to other people. As a grad student, there's a lot of advantages. You can have a community that is not just in your research area. And I think at the graduate level, we're trying to push for that, to be more a community in the college, and not really go through, oh, you're from oceanography and you're from geography, then we're going to hang out only with the oceanography people. I don't know if that answered your question.
One more perspective, and then we're going to wrap up and see a trailer. Go ahead, Lori.
So I've been here 6 years, and the collegiality is actually one of the things that attracted me here. I don't know what started it, but I know that it's a really good thing, and it's a really great thing for science. Science is better with friends, and really great science happens with excellent colleagues. So, I think maybe part of it is that, resources are scarce, and, to do the best science, we get by with less by working with our colleagues who might share equipment that have special skills that we don't have. And so I think that that collegiality actually is one of the things that makes us really great at what we do, because we are able to work really well with our colleagues.
And I'll just close by saying that, you know, oceanography is such an inherently interdisciplinary effort where some of the best discoveries sort of come at the margins, where the disciplines come together. And the backgrounds that different scientists bring to the field really enrich it. And the more you have those kinds of interactions and contacts, the more the discoveries advance. So we're going to close by showing a trailer for the film Saving Atlantis. And I'm going to take this moment to thank our panelists for sharing their stories and to thank you all for coming.